So there's the completed chassis, 6.2 liter, 6L80, new process 241J. Got all the OEM GM wiring harness. Coming all the way down the back, got my evap and my fuel lines, and I've got them up out of the holder here, so they'll go across well above where the exhaust is going to go through on the chassis. Coming back here, I've installed my new Mopar pump, and I've also installed the closed loop feedback system for the evap system. So I've relocated the evap canister, installed fuel pressure tank sensor, and a vent valve. Also installed the new Mopar valve, or excuse me, fill tube that has the check valve in it. There's my new Nitto Ridge grapplers, 37-inch. It'll be going on it once I get it up and running. And coming around this side, flange on the transfer case, Tom Woods flange for the 1350 U-joint, new drive shaft when I get it measured. There's the driver's side of the transmission, the upstream O2 sensor, and downstream O2 sensors on the chassis harness. You can see it right there. So everything's tied up neatly along here. Here's the connector for the emissions harness. It will tie in with the engine harness when it gets to that point. So right now, just got all the engine harness laid over on top of the motor, brake system out of the way, and we're getting ready to drop the body onto the chassis. Coming up inside the engine bay, I've got my new heater hoses installed. They are, I believe they're 60 inches long on the long side with a 4-inch on the 90. That's to clear the truck intake manifold. The LS3s have a lower manifold, so you can actually access those without the with the engine in the on the body on the chassis. Coming around, it's got them laying up on top of the battery tray for the time being. There is my new radiator, 52mm dual pass, along with a 19-inch Camaro SS Outrunner pulse width modulated fan, all bolted together and sitting down in the body where it's supposed to be, and ready to drop the body and then start getting it mounted and finish up wiring and go on from there. But there's the radiator. So this has got to go that way, maybe half an inch. Where it's placed on the nut. Yeah. This is the back side of the nut, so dead center in the hole, but we want to be on the back side.
That should be very close.
Take this up and pull this slowly in the inch. Go over and that drops that side. Okay, ready? Actually, that AC line is really what I'm concerned with when I have it. We want to make sure we don't see
AC line on my side?
the AC line on the body, on the
Yeah, on my side?
body.
Hold on. Yes.
Damn, this is like dead. Well, let's go.
Oh, yeah.
Your way. Oh. Damn, you're right there.
they're in there.
We want them dead center. I don't want to scratch anything. We're going to tug this just this way, just a little bit on the lift. Grab something metal and push it this way because it's 16. Yeah, find something metal, would you?
These damn JKs. I think that's it. That's right there.
Actually too far.
No.
Yeah, we was favoring this side, now we're favoring that side. I went an 8, I wanted to go 16.
You're there.
Yeah, that's dead nuts in the middle. That's dead nuts in the middle. Brakes. Good.
I think so.
Got touchdown. Not getting anywhere, are we? Boy, there's not a lot of clearance on that freaking front pulley, is there?
No, there is not.
Damn, there's a
It's solid.
3/4 of an inch.
Don't lower it, please don't lower it. Splash me like the movie.
All right, touchdown. The body is down in position. Walk over here, I got my heater hoses. Let's get up on top here and you look down onto the engine, and it actually is a pretty good fit. It's tight, but it fits. So there's my CSF 2-inch or 52 millimeter radiator, Camaro SS fan, and then all the Jeep accessories with the Motec billet brackets. And you can see the clearance in the back there for the AC lines. There's a good inch on top, an inch and a half, maybe inch and 3/4 on the bottom. Heater hoses coming around this side back there. Plenty of clearance coming along. Once I get things cleaned up, I'll actually zip tie the heater hoses up here to the battery tray. I've got decent clearance on the coil packs to the battery tray, probably 2 inches. Spark plugs, I haven't, driver's side I can get to easily. Down in here behind by the steer, probably just remove the steering shaft and I can get to all the 4 on the driver's side. Passenger side, I'm gonna bet I've got to pull the inner fender, which is no big deal because I had to do that on the 3.8. And then they were right there, so spark plugs don't look too bad to have to get out. Yeah, so I'm going to start hooking things up. Hooking up my wiring. I got here's my GM E38 connectors, my power distribution connector. Probably the first thing I had to do is get the thing up in the air and get all my body secured back to the chassis and hook all it back up. Then come around and start working on the front here, and I'll start with the brake system, getting it all bolted in place so I can start laying the wiring for its final resting place around it. But yeah, it's in there. There's my 6.2 LS engine in the 2011 Jeep. All right, I apologize. I've gotten way behind on video documenting this last portion. Just got set into doing all the wiring and connecting of things, and I kept forgetting to grab the camera. So I apologize, but I'm going to hurry and cover the basics. I explained earlier that this wasn't going to be necessarily a step-by-step, but let me go over what I've done so far. So last I left off, I think I was setting the body down and had all the wiring laid on top of the engine. So since then, I've got the cooling system all hooked up. You can see my hoses are flat on a pancake. I've pulled a vacuum. It's been holding about 25 inches of vacuum for quite a while here in the shop. So I got a good tight cooling system. So if you look back along the firewall here, I've got my heater hoses. Once I set it down, I did have to raise the body back up. They were sticking out just a little bit too far and barely touching the back of the manifold. So I trimmed about 1.5 inches off, which brought them back in closer. So it comes right off the nipple of the heater core and turns, and I'm clearing by an easy inch and at least 1.5 inches now on the back of the intake manifold. and then I've put some sleeving over it where I've got it zip tied and secured to the battery tray there. They come along, they run underneath the battery tray here and go down underneath to the ports, which also I have them clamped on at the lower, I don't know if you can see it or not, lower radiator hose down there, and I've got abrasion sleeving on it, abrasion sleeving on the power steering line. Also, while I'm right here, I've got my fan wired in, so I have abrasion and split loom on it. The abrasion is on the positive and negative cables that run under the reservoir along the line here, back along behind the tip-em, and come over for the where it meets up the battery. The signal line for the pulse width modulation fan is this split loom. It runs underneath, through, and along this loom over to the ECM. Everything on this side pretty much is wrapped up by now. Like I said, all my coolant system is all secured and ready to go. Wiring, I've got my battery cables run. I installed abrasion resistance on the ground as well as the one coming over here underneath to the tip-em. So that's all taken care of. Wiring along the back, I've got about 5 wires that I need to encase in some split loom, but that's just for accessories. So I'm not as concerned about putting that in right now until I get the engine pretty much buttoned up. Okay, coming over to the other side. Coming over to the driver's side of the engine bay. Again, it's a little busy right here just because I have some hot soldered heat shrink connections going down to my discrete wired analog gauge for my transmission temperature, as well as my oil pressure that I've wired in. The other factory loom comes off the GM side, comes under, goes right between the master cylinder and the ABS module, and loops one branch, goes back to my interior connector, which is right down here, and then the interior connector goes obviously into the interior. So that's fed through the opening where on a 6-speed on a manual transmission Jeep, the opening where the clutch pedal would come through in the master cylinder for the clutch would reside. I went through that hole into the interior. So all I have left to do is mount my accelerator pedal, my ALDL connector, my tap switch, or my switch for tap shift, and tap into the back of the gauge cluster for the CAN bridge. Oh, and mount the CAN bridge, mount the MOCAN. So then the other portion of the harness comes forward, over, and I've had to make a few solder connections into C1 and C3. The other connections are hooked up here under the Jeep PCM. My other wiring goes over down to the alternator, AC compressor, and the high pressure switch on the condenser line, high pressure line for the AC. All my AC lines are buttoned up. So that took me quite a while because the engine sits further forward. So, well, also you got 2 more cylinders, but where the compressor sits is actually further forward than the V6. And I'm reusing the original lines, but I had to get a little creative on bending slightly the aluminum line to create a big enough loop for the line so it wouldn't kink. So it took me a couple, I don't know, 8 or 10 trial and errors to get that tweaked just right. But all my AC system is all set up now. I even test fit my engine cover, and it fits right underneath those 2 lines. So I think I'll be able to run that. I haven't tried closing the hood yet or not, but it does physically fit in there. I just have to do trim a couple of little pieces yet. Let's see, down here also, down underneath is the connector for the evap system, as well for the vent valve, as well as the chassis harness, which includes the downstream driver's O2 sensor and all my evap monitoring system. And then lastly, it comes up here and terminates at the E38 computer. And then here is my power distribution board with the GM power distribution connector that's mounted up underneath, as well as a small Molex connector and my start signal from my dash ignition switch to the spade connector underneath on the circuit board, which sends it out to the GM side over to the starter motor. So this is pretty much, the engine is pretty much wired in the engine bay. Right now I just have to connect my transmission lines, fill my cooling system, mount my coolant surge tank, and pretty much everything in the engine bay is pretty much wrapped up. Then I'll move on to the interior. So I stopped by my local hydraulic supply store on the way home and picked up a couple of fittings. I've got steel braided lines on my transmission cooler from when I put it in a long time ago. So I wanted to stick with those rather than just the rubber lines onto the barbs on the General Motors lines. So I'm going to go under, lift it up now, go under, cut off back on those lines. I've got compression fittings going to a -6 JIC, so I should be able to just run these JIC lines and connect them right onto these compression fittings. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, then I can set it back down, and actually I think I'm done on the lift for a little bit until it comes time to putting drive shafts in and exhaust. Speaking of drive shafts, here's my new drive shafts that I just picked up yesterday. I'm going to be running a 1350 rear and a 1310 double carbon, both these double carbon fronts. Tom Woods drive shafts. So I'm excited. Tom's treated me real well in the past. I've run his shafts for, oh man, 20 plus years now. Even when he was over at 6 States, I was still having him build my drive shafts. So great drive shafts, great customer service, support, and he's close. He's only a couple miles away from where I live, so that's always a plus. So those will be going in, and those are the OEM L94 exhaust manifolds and heat shields. I'll probably just throw those up locally and see if anybody needs them. I doubt it, but I'd hate to just chuck them in the garbage. They're brand new. All right, making a little more progress here. So I got all my wires wrapped in split loom, and I think there's about 6 wires running over it. I got to put a fuse block over here, but everything's nice and tidied up. Run across there. Washer tubes going to the right location. My wires going up underneath for my A-pillar lights. Everything down under here going under to the Jeep PCM that needs to go there. Everything's going to the GM ECM that needs to go there. Power distribution. So pretty much everything on this side, other than the coolant reservoir at this point, is done. Everything over on that side is done except for terminating a fuse block that I'm going to put in. Rather than run individual fuses like I was running before, I bought a box that has six circuits in it, 1 hot. So I'm going to use that to power my lights and my accessories and so forth. It looks a little cleaner. Probably should have done that before, but I'd added everything else in one at a time. And whereas this will allow me, I think I need 4 circuits. So anyway, three or four circuits, because there's a couple wires running over from my other A-pillar light. So that'll tidy all this side up. I'm going to go ahead and do my transmission cooler lines now, and my winch cables, and that should tie pretty much most of the engine stuff up and the engine base stuff up underneath. All right, little teaser shot here in the middle of all this wiring. I just went and picked up my I'd ordered my Nitto, my 37 1250 17 Nitto Ridge Grapplers on a Black Friday deal, and they just come in about the middle of January. So I ran down and had them mounted up on my Raceline Avenger street locks. So little teaser shot there of how they're going to look. So I just rolled one up in front of the Jeep there. Well, that'll change the personality just a little bit. There's the old one and the new one in the same shot there. So I'm going from the 35 KO2s to the 37 Nitto Ridge Grapplers. My old wheels were ATX Crawl 17x9s, and these again are Raceline Avenger 17x9s. So I'd give it a nice little facelift, just something different. Okay, back to wiring. All right, so I just got the interior somewhat put back together. The dash is just sitting on there. I can just snap it all back in and bolt it down. So interior, you've got accelerator pedal connector, and I put the GM accelerator pedal on. The diagnostic data link, ALDL, whatever you want to call it. I snapped the Chrysler one out and zip tied it kind of alongside and put the GM one in. So Anything body-wise, ABS-wise, anything like that, I'll plug into the Jeep side. Anything for emissions and Mode 6 data and any engine diagnostics, anything will go into the one that's in the actual crate, the OEM cradle, and that'll be the GM one. So over here I've run my wires up. This wire here that's zip tied in a loop here is for my Aeroforce gauge that I installed right there on the column. So this wire right here, this split loom right here goes up and over, and I had to pull the cluster out, and there's 2 wires you cut, and you basically bridge it in, and that's where the CAN module goes. The bridge goes between the Jeep side and the GM side, or interpreter box, whatever you want to call it. So anyway, I've got some interior to put back together. Over here, you can see on the side right next to my switches, right above my right knee, this is where my tap switch from the tap switch is. So out front here, I've got my coolant system filled, got my coolant reservoir mounted, line coming up through here. I still need to go down underneath and trim. I just got a long hose sticking down right now, but I need to trim it for the overflow. All this corner's all cleaned up, all the Jeep side and the GM wiring. AC lines are all connected, air filter duct and air filter is on, mass airflow sensor, throttle position sensor, everything's in place there. I just set the battery in it and hooked the positive negative up. I don't have any of my accessories or my winch, any of that stuff hooked up right now. I just have the fan and the main positive and negative. So we are going to get ready for the first start. All right, so here goes nothing. Like I say, I've got transmission fluid in it. I probably have to top it off, but I've got fluids in it. I do not have drive shafts on it, don't have exhaust on it yet. This is just going to be the first initial start. We'll see how it fires up. What I also did is I cycled, because I put a new fuel pump in it, so I cycled the key, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, hit the Schrader valve on the fuel rail, didn't have fuel yet, cycled it another 3 or 4 times, checked the Schrader valve, I had fuel. So what I don't want to do is have extended crank before I start, while I'm trying to start it. So what I've done is get fuel to the fuel rail, and here goes, fingers crossed. And she starts. And that's a successful start. I can live with that. So, sigh of relief. Now, one thing worth mentioning is I do have a check engine light. More than likely, I haven't hooked the scanner up. More than likely, it'll be one of 2 things. Obviously, I think it's going to be my O2 sensors because I do not have my exhaust on yet. But more than likely, I'm going to get a P0315 code, which is quite common anytime you have a new ECM, sometimes even after the ECM has been disconnected for an extended period of time. But what that is, the P0315 is basically, it's a crankshaft calibration. So basically it has to, the ECM has to learn the crankshaft signal. So once I get buttoned up, I'll go through the procedure and show you how you have to do a crankshaft relearn. And it's basically pretty simple. Most of your high-end scanners can do it. I think you can do it through the aero force gauge. I'm not positive, but I'm just going to hook up my snap-on scanner and go through that. And what you'll do is you'll go into crankshaft relearn. It's one of the diagnostic tools, and it'll tell you to turn everything off, go through a series of things, and then it'll tell you to floor it, and it'll rev to, I believe, I'm not sure. I don't even dare. I think it's like 4,000 RPM, but I'm not. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, it'll rev, and then your check engine light will go out. Basically, what that means is the ECM has now recognized what the crankshaft signal looks like, and so anytime now it can accurately measure for misfires and so forth. Now that it knows what the crankshaft signal is supposed to look like, it has a baseline. So I will go through and show how that's done when I get to that point. But I think right now I'm going to button up things under the hood, get it up in the air, and probably do my exhaust. That's probably the next thing. Maybe put my interior back together. And I had a 50-50 shot at getting my tap switch installed correctly, and I got it wrong. It's upside down, so I got to turn that around. So I'm glad I didn't button the dash up all the way. Okay, so while I've got it up in the air, tidying up the last little bit before the exhaust, I figured I'd give you a little visual underneath. So there's the output of the transfer case looking forward, dual stud transmission mount. Over on this side you can see the advanced adapters, transfer case, shift cable, as well as the transmission. And if you look up right there, you can see I've got adequate clearance around the bell housing and the body, good couple of inches. Moving forward, there's the passenger side manifold. And I don't know if I can get around there or not, but you can see I got a good 1 3/4, 1.5 3/4 there anyway. There's starter motor heat shield. So this is the Trailblazer manifold again. So it's going to come down, and then the cat will be right in here. So there's my transmission lines, oil pan, AC compressor right down on the lower driver's side. And there's my oil sending unit that I wired in. This is for my analog gauge up on my A-pillar, so run the wiring for that up and tied in up by the factory GM loom. Go around the front, and here you can see the front. There's my transmission lines, 1/2-inch compression to an NPT, and then an NPT to JAC adapter, because my transmission cooler lines had JAC, -6 JAC fittings on them. So nice routed right under the cross member there. And then there's my power steering, cooler, and on my steering, hydraulic assist steering, ram. So everything underneath here is done up. I'll go ahead and lower it down now and take a final shot of the engine bay for you. So here's the finished engine bay. I put a fuse block back here with fuses for my accessories, my lights and so forth, and I tucked them all up inside that loom that's right alongside the OEM loom. Here's the busy corner over here. Everything tied up, and either abrasion loom or split loom, or coolant, surge tank, and then there's my AC, or not my AC, my air duct and filter. I still have to get a T-bolt. They had a screw type with the air filter, so I need to get a T-bolt style so that I can fasten it into that little bracket right there and hold it fairly secure. There's my winch lines running around. The only thing I really have to hook up yet on my battery is my winch cables and my ARB dual air compressors. Everything else is all secured to the battery and powered up. So the engine cover, I need to figure out a way of securing that. The little rubber mounts where you push down onto a ball stud are quite tall and they won't allow the hood to close. So right there where it's sitting right there, the hood doesn't touch it. So I need to figure out a way of bringing everything down to that level, because I'd really like to run that engine cover. The only thing I really had to do is I had to trim it a little bit over here, and I had to trim it a little bit right here so it would sit down lower. But other than that, I should be able to run it. I got plenty of clearance down here on all my drive accessories. Gap under my radiator hose to my air duct. I trimmed and cleaned up the edge here for this plastic shrouding over my radiator. My son wanted me to keep the polished aluminum radiator exposed, but I'm trying to keep it as OE looking as possible, so I wanted to put that back on. Grill's all back in. Transmission cooler. Everything's back in place where it was, so there's the distribution, power distribution, and the E38 computer. The Jeep PCM is still here. It has a few functions left in, that's about it. On my AC lines I was able to retain. Had to do a little tweaking on this one here just to straighten it out to clear the coolant surge tank. There's my C100 connector to the interface wiring. So everything pretty much lays right back in. Doesn't seem to be any interference issues. Between the head on this side, I've got probably 1.5 inches. On the back side over there, I've probably got a good 3/4 of an inch. Down on my compressor, the other tight spot on my pulley, and I've got a good 1/2 inch down there, 3/8 to 1/2 inch. I had to shift the motor back a little bit to allow this air duct to drop down in. It was hitting the power steering pulley. So once I did that, it really changed some other clearances. So I had to shift it back about 1/2 inch. But that's pretty much where it sits in the engine bay. Doesn't seem to be any interference issues. As soon as I get the exhaust done, I'll take it out for a test drive. But that is pretty much the extent of my 6.2 liter L94 LS GM engine, 6L80 transmission into my 2011 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch, and if you like it, give me a thumbs up, and I welcome the comments. Thanks for watching.